Today we're going to do a quick overview of migration to Juarez and El Paso in the early 20th century. Traditionally, people have talked about immigration as the consequence of push and pull factors, and I don't want us to think of it that way, but I do want to introduce you to the concept since it's so widely used. According to this, people move from one country to another either because they are pushed out or because they are pulled in. When we think about Mexico in the early 20th century, push factors could be people are pushed out by the violence of the Mexican Revolution. People are pulled into the United States by job recruiters in agriculture, in railroads, and in mining. So you have that push and pull. What I don't like about this kind of analysis is that it makes Mexico and the United States seem very independent of each other, and that's not true. To go back to the example I just gave, if we say that Mexican migrants are being pushed out of Mexico because of the Mexican Revolution, while that is true, it doesn't include the U.S. contribution to that. In previous lectures, I've talked to you about increasing foreign investment on the part of the United States, especially in agriculture and mining. Well, the wages paid in these industries helped to lay the foundation for the Mexican Revolution. So the United States does have a role to play in the Mexican Revolution, which pushes people out of the country. If we just say the Mexican Revolution pushes Mexicans out, we don't see the role of the other side of the border. The same thing in saying pull, that recruiters pull Mexican workers to the United States through higher wages. We don't see then the Mexican part. In Mexico, wages, as I've said in previous lectures, are very low during the Porfiriato. And people are pulled to the north of Mexico because wages are higher. And then recruiters from the US pull them across by even higher wages. But as a caveat, these higher wages are still very low. So push-pull separates the two nations, and it doesn't allow us to see the connection between the two. But there is a connection. What is happening on one side influences the other side. So migration from Mexico to the United States is a consequence both of what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in the United States, and the ways in which the United States gains economic control in Mexico during the Porfiriato. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been very hard to cross the border. The rules keep changing about who can cross and who cannot cross. And while that makes sense because we are in the midst of a pandemic, I can also tell you that the rules of who can cross and how people can cross have been changing for the past century, more than a century. As you know, I'm the director of the Institute of Oral Histories, and I've used a lot of oral histories in my research. There are oral histories that are taken in the 1970s of people who were born at the turn of the 20th century who talk about how easy it was to cross the border when they were younger. They talk about, we crossed freely. Those are the words that they often use. We crossed freely prior to 1917. This is a photograph taken by a very well-known photographer here in the area, Otis Altman. He has a lot of amazing photographs of the Mexican Revolution. You can find them at the El Paso Public Library, and you can also find them at special collections in the UTEP Library. So you can see in this photograph that this woman is simply crossing, riding on her animals across the Rio Grande. People could walk across the bridge when the immigration officer was not there without showing papers, without applying. So people did cross freely back and forth before 1917 to visit family, to go shopping, to work. So the border was much more open in this period we're talking about. Immigration laws in the United States began to get more and more focused on keeping certain people out, beginning with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first time that the United States actually prohibited a specific nationality from coming into the United States. And it was a consequence of the deeply rooted anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, especially coming out of California. Prior to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were ways that people could be kept from entering the country, but they were not based on nationality. You would be kept out if you had an infectious disease, for example. You would be kept out if you were considered, and these are the words, an imbecile. You could be kept out if you could not support yourself. In 1917, a new Immigration Act was passed, and it was targeted towards keeping out poor Europeans. I've talked about this in a previous lecture. 1917 is when World War I is coming to an end. There's a lot of destruction, a lot of suffering, a lot of desperate people in Europe, and they are coming to the United States. The U.S. Congress passes the 1917 legislation in order to keep out poor Europeans. So two big parts of this law are, one, a head tax of $8 per adult. People in this time period who are poor working people are earning the equivalent of perhaps 25 cents a day. How can you ever save up $8 if you're earning 25 cents a day and that's what you live on? The second part of this law that I want to point out is the literacy test. You had to prove that you were literate in a language. It didn't have to be English. It could be in your own language. But at a time when education was very limited, this served to keep out people. So even though it was intended to keep out poor Europeans, it also kept out poor Mexicans. The U.S. economy, however, was so dependent on the labor of poor Mexicans that employers, especially agricultural employers, begged the federal government to allow Mexican workers in. So in 1917, there is a creation of the Temporary Admissions Act. And the Temporary Admissions Act said that Mexicans could enter the country to work in agriculture on a temporary basis without paying the head tax, without passing the literacy test. This becomes the precursor to the 1940s, to the World War II Bracero program that brought in Mexican men to work in the fields and in the railroads. This is an example of how Mexican immigration has been vital to the economic growth of the United States and the ways in which the U.S. government has brought in Mexican workers when necessary to the U.S. economy, but then pushed them back when the government felt they were no longer necessary. In a previous lecture, I talked about border making and the way that border making starts by creating a specific borderline, usually through war, through military might. Then the border gets reinforced through the use of legislation, like the 1917 Immigration Act that I just talked about. It also gets reinforced through policing. So, as you can see, in 1927, the Border Patrol is created. This is a photo of the Border Patrol in El Paso, and it gets even harder to start to cross the border. So we go from 1917, when people were saying we can cross freely, to 1927, when there is increased surveillance of the border, and there is increasing hardening of the border. Over the course of the past 100 years, when we look at movement from Mexico to the United States, migration from Juarez to El Paso, we're going to find that it is harder and harder to cross, unless you are wealthy, and that's a different story. While at the same time the United States government is willing to make these concessions to employers to find ways to bring in Mexican workers outside of the legislation so they can provide cheap labor to the United States.